Imagine a single, tense evening. You're in a quiet Cambridge room, and the intellectual titans of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Karl Popper, they're all there, together, for the only time ever.
And what happens? Well, a 10-minute argument involving a fireplace poker of all things, but it becomes this legend, a real flashpoint for these huge philosophical and very personal clashes.
Exactly. It's more than just a story, isn't it? It's like this perfect little window, a singular lens, really, to understand the incredibly intricate lives, the massive intellectual contributions, and, the turbulent times that shaped Wittgenstein and Popper, two absolute giants of philosophy.
Absolutely giants. And that's our mission today on the deep dive. We're plunging right into this infamous poker incident, October 25th, 1946, Cambridge's Moral Science Club.
And our guide for this, we're drawing meticulously from David Edmonds and John Eidinow's fantastic book, Wittgenstein's Poker, The Story of a 10-Minute Argument. It's incredibly well-researched.
Oh, it's a treasure trove, full of details, anecdotes, historical context. It lets us get way beyond just the surface story of, who waved the poker.
Right. Our goal here is to really unpack the layers. We're not just asking what happened. We want to shed light on why. Why did it go down like that?
We'll dig into the core philosophical disagreements, the pretty intense personal rivalries, and the bigger picture, the societal forces shaping these thinkers, and their legacy, of course, their impact on modern thought.
So this deep dive should give you a really unique and hopefully efficient way to grasp these complex ideas and the people behind them. We've got some surprising facts, deep context, things you might not find elsewhere.
Let's set the scene then. Where are we?
We're in room 3, staircase H, Gibbs Building, Cambridge. The date, October 25th, 1946. Time, precisely 8:50 p.m.
And it's not some grand hall, right? It's intimate.
Exactly. A set of rooms, study, bedroom, views over the River Cam. You can just picture it, can't you? That kind of closed setting.
Yeah.
It would definitely heighten the intensity of any intellectual fight, like a pressure cooker.
Absolutely. And what makes this specific evening so incredibly significant, historically speaking, is that this was it. The only time these three, Popper, Wittgenstein, Russell, were ever in the same room together.
The only time. It's mind-boggling, really.
It elevates everything that happened, makes it this unique interception point in philosophical history, like a rare planetary alignment for philosophy.
A cosmic alignment for philosophy. I like that. So let's quickly introduce the players again. First, Dr. Karl Popper. He's the guest speaker, traveled up from London.
Reader in Logic and Scientific Method at LSE.
And his paper title sounds almost innocent, doesn't it? Are there philosophical problems?
Yeah.
But as we'll see, for Popper, that was absolutely loaded.
Very loaded. Then you have Professor Ludwig Wittgenstein. He's chairing the club meeting, widely seen as, well, the most brilliant philosopher of his time, a real intellectual force of nature. His presence alone changed the room.
An absolute force. And finally, Bertrand Russell. He's 74 by this point. By far the most famous of the three, publicly speaking.
A household name. Philosopher, mathematician, campaigner. Millions knew Russell. You could almost say he was the real audience that night for both Popper and Wittgenstein. A kind of silent heavyweight judge.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so Popper's title. Are there philosophical problems? This immediately hits a nerve, doesn't it? It cuts right to this fundamental clash between him and Wittgenstein.
It really does. For Popper, the answer was a clear, emphatic yes. He absolutely believed there are genuine philosophical problems, and they demand serious, rigorous, rational investigation. Solutions, even.
He saw philosophy as vital, tackling these deep, substantial questions, almost like science tackles its problems.
Precisely. But Wittgenstein, a completely different perspective. Stark contrast. He argued that many things we call philosophical problems are actually linguistic puzzles.
Puzzles, meaning?
Meaning they arise from confusion, from misusing language or misunderstanding how it works. So for Wittgenstein, philosophy's job wasn't to solve these problems in the traditional sense, to clarify language, to untangle the knots. And by doing that, the problems would simply dissolve, disappear.
Like clearing up a misunderstanding rather than discovering a new truth.
And this ties directly into his later philosophy, the shift away from his early work, his famous idea that meaning is use.
Right, the philosophical investigations era.
Yeah. The meaning of a word isn't some fixed definition, but how it functions in our activities, our social contexts, what he called forms of life.
Like knowing how to use a tool, not just defining it.
Perfect analogy. And this led him to reject the idea of a private language, a language only one person could understand. He argued it's incoherent.
Because language is inherently public, social.
Exactly. And that has huge implications. It undermines Descartes' whole project, doesn't it? The cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, trying to build knowledge from pure internal certainty.
How so?
Because for Wittgenstein, even the meaning of thinking itself depends on a shared public understanding. You can't establish it purely inside your own head. It pulls the rug out from under centuries of foundationalist philosophy.
Yeah.
It was a massive shift.
Wow. Okay, so this isn't just some dry academic point scoring. This is a fundamental clash about what knowledge is and how we even get it. Two totally different approaches.
Absolutely. And the arguments between them that night over this very divide, well, they instantly became legendary. Everyone knew right then this was a major intellectual battle playing out.
Right there in that small Cambridge room. Which brings us to the poker, the contested narrative. This is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, a bit messy.
It does. So Karl Popper's version, the one he told often, he described Wittgenstein nervously fiddling with a fireplace poker. Using it, he said, like a conductor's baton to emphasize his assertions.
Already quite a dramatic image.
Very. And then Popper claims the debate turned to ethics. He challenged Wittgenstein. Give me an example of a moral rule.
And Popper's retort.
Popper claimed he shot back. Not to threaten visiting lecturers with pokers. According to him, this made Wittgenstein throw the poker down in a rage, storm out, and slam the door.
That's the famous story, and it's the one that stuck, right? It ended up in Popper's obituaries in 1994. It became the public memory.
It absolutely did, but the other people there, their accounts differ significantly.
Okay, like who?
Well, take Wasfi Hijab. He was the minute taker, a young graduate student. His official minutes of the meeting are famously, even unusually, brief and understated about the whole confrontation.
So no mention of rage or door slamming.
Not explicitly endorsing Popper's dramatic details, no. It hints at tension, sure, but it's very restrained, almost deliberately vague, you could say.
Interesting. And other witnesses.
Some said Wittgenstein just left abruptly, no door slam. But then you get someone like Professor Peter Geach. Decades later, he was still passionate about it. He flatly said, Popper lied.
Lied. Strong word.
Very. Geach insisted Wittgenstein left before Popper made the famous poker threat comment, which completely changes the dynamic, doesn't it?
It totally does.
Yeah.
It raises huge questions about memory, especially under pressure.
Look at Professor Watkins, another eyewitness. He apparently expressed uncertainty about his own memory after being challenged on it, and even adjusted his account later. It just shows how fallible memory is, especially when strong feelings or maybe allegiances are involved.
It's not just about what happened, but what we remember, and maybe even want to remember.
Precisely. And what's really revealing is that Popper knew his version was controversial. His personal archives have notes where he defends his account, insists his memory was very clear, despite getting a few dates slightly wrong.
He even thought about the exact word to use.
Yes. He considered insight, seduce, bait, challenge, before finally landing on provoke to describe what he intended with his remark. It suggests a very conscious shaping of the narrative.
So this incident became really central to how Popper saw himself.
Oh, completely. The outsider challenging the establishment. The poker incident was his glorious triumph over Wittgenstein, his philosophical nemesis.
Which leads to that psychological question. Was he deliberately misrepresenting it? Or did his own strong beliefs, his own narrative kind of create a fixed, maybe false memory?
It's impossible to know for sure, but neuropsychiatrists like Peter Fenwick mentioned in the book talk about how our strongly held schemas, our mental frameworks, can make us fit events into our memory in a way that confirms our beliefs, even if it's not quite accurate.
So the retelling itself became part of his identity.
Undeniably, the battle and his version of it was core to who he was.
So regardless of the exact sequence, poker up, poker down, comment before or after the poker itself becomes this powerful symbol.
Absolutely. It stands for the unremitting zeal of both men, their intense drive for philosophical truth, a lightning rod for their intellectual energy.
And the actual poker, what happened to it?
That's another mystery. One story suggests the host, Richard Braithwaite, got rid of it later, supposedly to stop academics and journalists constantly asking about it.
Wow, a vanished philosophical artifact. Okay, let's pivot now and dive deeper into these two remarkable thinkers, starting with Wittgenstein. Ascetic, dominant revolutionary.
Right, Ludwig Wittgenstein. He came from, well, unimaginable wealth in Vienna, one of the most prominent, richest assimilated Jewish families. second only to the Rothschilds, apparently.
His father, Karl, was a steel tycoon.
A major industrialist, yes. A business genius, but also a huge patron of the arts. So Ludwig grew up surrounded by privilege, culture, high intellect.
Yet he chose the opposite, extreme austerity.
He did. Gave away his inheritance, lived very simply, famously spent 6 years teaching in remote, poor Austrian villages. It baffled people. Thomas Bernhard called the multimillionaire as a village schoolmaster a piece of perversity.
Was it just eccentricity or something deeper?
It seems deeper, rooted partly in a family tradition of social work, but also a very personal drive to shed what he saw as the burden of privilege, to find something more authentic. He deliberately turned his back on it all.
And his personality matched his intense ideas.
Yeah.
Formidable.
Absolutely. Wasfi hijab, remember the minute taker? He described Wittgenstein as being like an atomic bomb, a tornado, someone who could just obliterate your intellectual foundations, even your faith.
His presence at the Moral Science Club was overwhelming.
So much so that the club actually brought in a rule, the starring system, to exclude senior academics from certain meetings. Everyone knew it was aimed squarely at Wittgenstein.
Why?
Because he'd constantly interrupt speakers, often brutally. The critic, F.R. Leavis, said, Wittgenstein's discussions were discussions carried on by Wittgenstein. Total dominance.
And physically intense, too. People commented on his appearance.
Yes. Descriptions mention his huge, great forehead, penetrating eyes, the intensely white surrounds, all the anxiety lines making a checkerboard. You get a sense of this immense internal pressure manifesting physically.
Yet, despite this, or maybe because of it, he inspired incredible loyalty.
Fierce loyalty. Students would start dressing like him, arguing like him, became scruffier versions of Wittgenstein.
But then, paradoxically, he'd tell his brightest students to quit academia, go do manual labor.
Yeah, like Yorick Smithies. Wittgenstein genuinely thought manual work was good for the brain, even if they were totally unsuited physically. Some parents thought he was a malign genius for it.
It reflects that deep conviction he had, doesn't it? The value of the practical, the lived, over just abstract thought.
Completely. Now, his philosophy, also full of shifts and paradoxes. His first major work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he thought he'd basically solved philosophy with it.
Squeezed the lemon dry, as he put it.
Right. But later, he said the real point of the book was ethical, and the most important part was everything he hadn't written, the stuff that can only be shown, not said.
That early work with Russell was logical atomism, right? Finding the basic building blocks of language and reality.
It's essentially, yes, trying to reveal a hidden logical structure beneath everyday language. But then, his thinking radically changed, sparked by talks with Moritz Schlick and the Vienna Circle.
Leading to the philosophical investigations.
That's where we get language games and meaning as use. Language as a toolkit embedded in our forms of life, our shared practices. Not a picture of reality, but a set of tools.
And this is where he rejects the private language idea and challenges Descartes.
Because if meaning comes from public use, then a purely private internal foundation for knowledge, like Descartes sought, just doesn't hold up. Even I think, therefore I am, relies on a shared understanding of thinking. It's revolutionary.
And personally, he was tormented.
Deeply. Battled suicidal thoughts from a young age. Said himself he'd contemplated it on several occasions. He needed solitude. Retreated to incredibly remote places, Norway, Ireland.
Tormented by feelings, too, and this need for exactitude.
Yes, intense feelings, often towards young men. Deep questions about love. And this legendary need for exactitude went beyond philosophy, demanding precisely cast radiators, making builders raise a ceiling by 3 centimeters after the house was finished.
Wow, that pursuit of precision sometimes overshadowed basic human considerations.
It often seemed to. A complex, brilliant, deeply troubled man.
Okay, let's shift to Karl Popper, the enemy of totalitarianism, champion of critical rationalism. Also Viennese, also from an assimilated Jewish family.
Yes, but a different social sphere. Bourgeois, not aristocratic like the Wittgensteins. A significant gap.
And his family converted to Protestantism.
They did, like many assimilated Jews at the time. Perhaps drawn to the work ethic, the emphasis on individual conscience. Popper later identified as Protestant, evangelical, but of Jewish origin. Yet he strongly resisted any connection to Jewish Orthodox groups. A complex relationship with his heritage, it seems.
And unlike Wittgenstein choosing austerity, Popper experienced hardship out of necessity.
Very much so. Lost his father's money in the post-WWI inflation. Lived rough as a student. Worked as a cabinet maker, a teacher. His success was hard-won. He was apparently quite oversensitive about his early lack of recognition. A real self-made intellectual.
And he defined himself through opposition, didn't he?
Absolutely. Explicitly. Not just against the Vienna Circle, but Plato, Hegel, Marx, Freud. He lumped Freud with pseudoscientists, and of course, most fiercely, against Wittgenstein. He wasn't just an opponent. He saw himself as the triumphant opponent.
He wanted to be in the Vienna Circle but wasn't invited.
That's right. He longed for it but remained an outsider. And he proudly claimed, "I invented the difficulties for them," emphasizing his critical independence.
And his big idea, the one he's most famous for, is falsification.
Definitely. From his 1934 book, Logik der Forschung, The Logic of Scientific Discovery in English. Falsification as the line between science and non-science.
Explain that again briefly.
Scientific theories, he argued, must make bold predictions that could be proven wrong. They have to be testable, falsifiable. The bolder the prediction that survives testing, the stronger the theory.
And this directly attacked the Vienna Circle's core idea.
Yes, their verification principle, that statements only have meaning if they're true by definition or can be empirically verified. Popper showed their own principle couldn't be verified. It failed its own test.
Clever. So his goal wasn't about meaningful versus meaningless language, like Wittgenstein.
No, not primarily. It was about rigorously separating real science from pseudoscience, like astrology or Marxism as he saw it. Demarcation was key.
And his other major work, The Open Society and Its Enemies. That was his war effort.
Exactly. Published in 1945. A passionate, powerful attack on philosophies he saw as leading to totalitarianism, Plato, Hegel, Marx. He fiercely argued against historical determinism, the idea that history has a set path or plot.
No plot to history. He believed philosophers had a duty to engage with real-world problems.
Absolutely. He even advocated for world government to prevent nuclear war, believed ideas had consequences, and that the pen was the best weapon against tyranny, especially after seeing violence fail in Vienna.
In his personality.
Yeah.
Also complex, aggressive, but also empathetic.
Very much so. Known for intellectual aggressiveness, like a blowtorch, pursuing arguments relentlessly, sometimes humiliating people, could erupt in terrifying rage.
But there was another side.
Yes, an alternative Popper. Empathetic, kind, tolerant, even romantic. A workaholic, loved English novels, could bellow with laughter. Claimed to be the happiest philosopher alive. A real duality there. The solitary supremacist and the compassionate man.
And after the war, the Open Society brought him recognition in Britain, even though Cambridge Uni Press had rejected it.
Yes, possibly to protect Wittgenstein, the book suggests. He got recognition, but interestingly, when offered posts at Cambridge and New Zealand, he chose the permanent, normal job in New Zealand. Shows his insecurity, perhaps.
He even asked for the Cambridge post to go to someone else.
To Fritz Weismann, yes, even though it was created for Popper. His fame grew hugely on the continent, seen as this tower of reason against fascism and communism. His reception was different in Britain, sometimes seen as admirable, but maybe less philosophically exciting than Wittgenstein.
Fascinating how context shapes reputation. Okay, let's bring in the third figure present that night, Bertrand Russell, the godfather, the campaigner, the observer.
Russell, 74 at the time of the poker incident. Immensely famous, way beyond philosophy circles.
A true public intellectual. Nobel Prize for literature, even?
Exactly. Prolific writer on everything. Logic, maths, social issues, peace. And his style, clear, witty, sharp, accessible. Considered the father of analytic philosophy, his influence is still huge in Anglo-American thought.
And a life dedicated to causes, often contentious ones. Jailed during World War I.
For anti-war writing, yes. Served his time quite comfortably, apparently, surrounded by books, studying philosophy, then jailed again in his 80s for anti-nuclear protests. Lived his principles.
Yes, Russell was his early mentor, sponsor, supporter, really recognized Wittgenstein's genius, worried about his mental state, helped bring him back to Cambridge.
But by 1946...
It had long since soured, turned into icy distance. Wittgenstein had developed this barely concealed contempt for Russell's philosophy, finding it superficial compared to his own later ideas.
And Popper's view of Russell, he admired him greatly. Popper was awestruck, called Russell our great master, dedicated a book to him, put him on par with Hume and Kant, huge admiration.
Was it mutual?
Not really, it seems. Russell acknowledged Popper's attack on Plato was brilliantly advocated, but Popper doesn't even get mentioned in Russell's autobiography, and their letters were polite, conciliatory, but not exactly a meeting of minds. The admiration seems mostly one way.
And Russell's view of the later Wittgenstein, the investigations.
He found it completely unintelligible, called it trivial, unfounded. He couldn't understand why a whole school of philosophy found important wisdom in it. He much preferred Popper's clarity.
So Russell's presence at that meeting, he's like this silent witness to the clash between these two younger thinkers, both of whom he'd influenced, but who had gone in such different directions. A symbol of the changing philosophical landscape.
Perfectly put. He embodies the shift. Okay, so we've looked at the individuals. Now let's talk about the place that forged them both. Vienna.
Right. This shared background, but experienced so differently. Both Wittgenstein and Popper, born into assimilated Jewish families in Vienna, a city of contradictions, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Brilliant creation in a nonetheless decaying culture, an amazing intellectual hub, Mach, Freud, Schoenberg, challenging old certainties, but also, chillingly, the seedbed for Hitler and the Holocaust.
That paradox is stark. Intellectual flourishing and deep-seated darkness side by side.
And the assimilation itself was paradoxical. These families converted, integrated. Popper's family became Protestant, Wittgenstein's ancestors Catholic and Protestant. But the Jewish question, as it was called, was always defined by the non-Jewish majority.
Anti-Semitism was deeply ingrained, even becoming racialized.
Yes, openly promoted by politicians like Karl. It shifted from economic resentment to this pseudoscientific biological racism, which basically destroyed any hope of true emancipation through assimilation. That apocryphal story of the Jewish officer being the only one to speak for Austria at a funeral. It captures that tragic, unrequited loyalty.
Popper felt this prejudice keenly, didn't he?
Acutely. He hated that observation. For the Goyim, he remains a Jew. For the Jews, he's still a Jew anyway. He angrily recognized it when people asked for his reaction as a Jew. This constant exclusion, the rising tide of overt anti-Semitism, it convinced him he had to leave Austria.
And fueled his ideas about the open society.
Profoundly. He took that ideal of rational debate, the Austrian idea as he saw it, into exile as a direct response to the closed, prejudiced society he was fleeing.
The Wittgensteins, though, initially felt immune because of their status and wealth.
They did, almost arrogantly so. Their unbelievable fame, connections. Ludwig himself apparently wasn't unduly disturbed right after the Anschluss, thought his sisters were too respected to be touched.
But reality hit hard.
Very hard. His brother Paul's shocked acknowledgement that they now counted as Jews really underscores their sudden, terrifying vulnerability. And the Nazi oppression in Austria was particularly brutal, immediate, targeting professionals, stripping rights.
Which brings us to how the Wittgensteins survived. It wasn't status, it was money.
Extraordinary wealth, yes. Much of it held outside Austria, especially in the U.S. And the Nazis desperately needed foreign currency for rearmament. So the Wittgenstein fortune became this bizarre, high-stakes bargaining chip.
They literally negotiated the racial status.
They did, directly with Berlin. They managed to secure Beifeing reclassification as Mischling, people of mixed Jewish-Aryan ancestry. This was incredibly rare. Hitler himself only approved 12 such applications out of over 2,000 in 1939.
Ludwig was involved in these negotiations, despite his anxieties.
Yes, he had technically become a German citizen and a German Jew under Nazi law because 3 grandparents were baptized as adults. He had to participate. The stakes were immense.
And the price?
Astonishing.
Equivalent to 1.7 tons of gold, about 2% of Austria's entire gold reserves that Berlin had seized, a sum massive enough to get the attention of the highest Nazi officials.
That payment saved his sisters from deportation. It did. But the cost wasn't just financial. The family was left deeply scarred, divided by anger and mutual incomprehension. Ludwig felt his sisters had been naive, endangered themselves, another casualty of Nazism.
And Popper's war effort, in contrast, was entirely intellectual.
Yes, the open society was his weapon, a fighting book. He believed the battle of ideas was paramount, that victory was best won with the pen, especially after seeing political violence fail firsthand in Vienna.
Okay, let's touch on the Vienna Circle, the intellectual hub of logical positivism, founded by Moritz Schlick.
Right. Schlick, a physicist turned philosopher, started it in 1922, became hugely influential, the most fashionable philosophical doctrine in the Western world for a time. Brilliant minds, Carnap, Gödel, aiming for a new scientific enlightenment.
And their view of Wittgenstein.
They revered him. A.J. Ayer said, Wittgenstein is a deity to them all. Saw Russell as just a forerunner. Schlick was apparently ecstatic after meeting him, saw him as a profound genius.
But Wittgenstein was difficult with him too.
Oh, yes. Deeply irritated by their manifesto. Often refused to discuss philosophy, would recite poetry instead. kept his distance, maintained his unique stance.
And Popper remained the outsider, the triumphant opponent.
Never formally invited, though he wanted to be. He relentlessly criticized their verification principle, pointing out it couldn't verify itself. He claimed his critiques sowed confusion, aiming not just at language, but at that crucial science-pseudoscience distinction.
This leads to the tragic story of Schlick's murder.
A truly chilling event. In 1936, Schlick was shot and killed by a former student, Johann Nelbach, who held various grievances.
But it wasn't treated just as a crime. It was politicized.
Horrifically so. The authoritarian state, deeply influenced by anti-Semitism and proto-Nazism, twisted the narrative. Schlick was painted as this decadent Jew philosopher corrupting Austrian youth. Nelbach, unbelievably, was portrayed almost as a hero acting out of ideological conviction.
Even though he confessed, he got a light sentence.
Shockingly lenient. It reflected this widespread, poisonous sentiment that Schlick, representing liberal Jewish ideas, somehow got what was coming to him. A terrifying example of how ideology could completely pervert justice. It shows the real danger intellectuals faced. So Vienna. This crucible shaped them both, pushed them in different directions. Let's now consider their enduring legacies. How do their ideas resonate today?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Their posthumous influence took such different paths. Wittgenstein published almost nothing in his lifetime, just a glossary and a lecture script.
Yet his notes filled volumes after his death, and his work has this incredible hold, not just in philosophy, but way beyond. Literature, art, he's treated almost like a literary figure. Proust, Kafka, Beckett.
Even people who disliked him personally, like Iris Murdoch calling him demonic, acknowledged his deep influence on their work. There's this enduring mystique.
Definitely. Popper's influence, on the other hand, seems more concrete, maybe more tied to historical moments, his attack on totalitarianism, his advocacy for the open society. It felt massively vindicated when communism collapsed.
His ideas provided the great answer to the disasters of ideology from 1917 onwards.
Exactly. But ironically, in stable democracies like Britain, he sometimes seemed, well, too normal to be interesting. His common sense was admired, but maybe not seen as fascinating in the way Wittgenstein was.
Shows how relevance shifts with the times. His solutions for the 20th century's crises perhaps made him seem less present later, though still fundamentally important, especially in political thought and science.
Right, so that core disagreement from the poker incident, Popper's problems versus Wittgenstein's puzzles, that still echoes, doesn't it?
It forces us to ask, when we grapple with a difficult question, are we tackling a genuine, deep problem? Or are we perhaps just caught in a linguistic or conceptual puzzle that needs clarification?
It's a crucial distinction. Think about Zeno's paradoxes, Achilles and the tortoise, the runner who can never leave the stadium.
Ancient brain teasers about motion and infinity.
Are they deep philosophical problems about the nature of reality, as maybe Popper or Aristotle might see them? Or are they clever linguistic puzzles arising from how we misuse words like motion or infinity, as Wittgenstein might argue? You can see the divide right there.
And Wittgenstein's response when accused of just dismissing problems: silence.
Mute, as the book says. For him, trying to draw a sharp line between sense and nonsense, or problem and puzzle, was itself crossing that line. His famous, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent.
Meaning some things, like ethics, are shown in how we live, not said in logical propositions.
That's the idea. It challenges the whole traditional philosophical project of trying to articulate everything logically.
Popper, meanwhile, fought against subjectivity, like improbability.
Yes, he argued probability is objective, out there in the world, not just a measure of our ignorance. For him, knowledge always advances through bold guesses, followed by rigorous attempts to shoot them down, conjecture and refutation, pushing boundaries, seeking objective understanding.
So, pulling this all together for you, our listener, what's the takeaway? We've seen two incredibly powerful, contrasting ways of approaching knowledge.
Popper's approach, emphasizing falsification, pushes us to be critical, to test our own assumptions relentlessly. Don't just look for confirmation. Actively try to disprove your ideas. That's how knowledge grows stronger.
While Wittgenstein, focusing on language games, urges us to examine our tools. How does language shape our thinking? Are we creating problems through misunderstanding our own concepts? Are we asking the right questions?
It helps us spot those conceptual knots, maybe untangle them before declaring them profound mysteries.
In today's world, with so much information flying around, being able to distinguish between a real intellectual problem needing deep work and a conceptual puzzle that might dissolve with clearer thinking. That's a vital skill.
Absolutely. Their insights apply everywhere. Navigating arguments, spotting rhetoric, communicating clearly, whether you're in a meeting, studying something new, or just trying to understand the world.
The legacies of Wittgenstein and Popper really remind us how you frame the question fundamentally shapes the answers you can possibly find.
Both pushed us to think about thinking itself, left us with richer tools.
So we journeyed through that single legendary night, the poker incident, using it to light up the complex lives and ideas of Wittgenstein and Popper. We looked at their clash over philosophical problems, their personal histories, the shadow of Vienna.
As we wrap up, here's a final thought to chew on. If language is a toolkit embedded in our forms of life, as Wittgenstein suggested, and if real progress comes from bold ideas tested fiercely, as Popper insisted, how could you use these insights?
What puzzles in your own work or thinking might clear up if you examine the language you're using? And what problems are out there waiting for you to frame a bold, testable hypothesis?
How much of your understanding relies on what's unsaid, what's just shown in context? And how much depends on having the courage to challenge established ideas, maybe even your own most cherished ones?
We hope this deep dive sparks your curiosity and encourages you to engage with complex ideas with maybe a bit more critical rigor and linguistic awareness.